didn't know it was invasive plant month until I started reading, and I thought, well, that must be why they asked me to do this on this date. And I couldn't get anybody. Richard wouldn't admit to doing it. I don't know whose fault it is that we're having invasive plants during invasive plant month, but somebody should take credit for that. Okay, let's see. You've got a test. I'm sure that being good students, you haven't tried to answer it or you haven't talked about it with your neighbors. I'm sure you haven't done that. And then there's some plants up here on the side that you looked at. Does anyone think they knew all 5 of them? Does anybody think they knew 2 of them? Okay, all right. Which 2 do you think you knew? She's on the spot.
It's not a jasmine, it's honeysuckle. Yeah, honeysuckle.
Okay.
And the
Chinaberry. Okay.
That's the only 2.
All right. What did you know?
The
tallow tree. Okay. Privet. There's a big handful of privet over there. That's what, 4 out of 5? Nobody knows the yellow blooming thing? Oh, that's important.
It is important.
That is important because what I would like to do with you today is visit some foreign plants behaving badly. And I want to ask you, do you think an invasion can happen here? Of course it can. Anybody recognize that fellow? That is a fire ant doing what a fire ant does. It has got skin pinched up where it is injecting bad itchy things, and then it is tucking its abdomen under so that it can literally sting where it has pinched up. And that's why you get those little blister spots anywhere a fire ant bit. And you know they're not from around here. When some of y'all are old enough to remember when we were kids, you know, we had lots of different kinds of ants, and you didn't want to get bit by ants, but they weren't big scary things, you know, and now we have very few other kinds of ants, but we've got the fire ants everywhere. And we can literally put a date on when fire ants arrived in the United States. We know it precisely. We know the name of the boat it came in on. But we don't know a lot of details about some of these other plants that I'm going to tell you about today. And some of them have been here for quite a long time. But all of them can be problems. We need to be careful about using the words invasive and aggressive. They are not interchangeable. Aggressive is a behavior that a plant from anywhere may exhibit. A native plant can be very aggressive in its growth. But being invasive actually has a definition. An invasive plant, they're plants, animals, or pathogens that are non-native to the place that you're talking about. So they came from somewhere else. And their introduction causes or is likely to cause economic or environmental harm or harm to human health. So, because the definition of invasive is that precise, anytime you're going to call a plant invasive, check yourself and say, is that what I really mean? After today, maybe you'll be a little bit more conscious of using the word invasive when it really fits. Where do they come from? if you had a long list of invasive plants and looked up every one of them to see where they came from, you would discover they come from all over. And if you think that North America is immune to being the source of invasive plants or animals, we're not. Other parts of the world are fighting plants that are native here. So it's a global situation. But as we look at the ones that trouble us the most, it seems like more of them come from Asia than anywhere else. So they come from everywhere, but more of them come from Asia than anywhere else. They are going to be happy in the same habitat, even though they've moved to a different continent. So you would not expect a desert plant to become a problem in a tropical rainforest. It doesn't matter which continent it is, it's not going to be happy there. So because ecosystems are global, as soon as a plant jumps to a new continent, if it can find that happy habitat, it's likely to establish itself. The thing is that in its own environment where it was created and born and lived for centuries and millennia, it was growing with other organisms. It had its friends, it had its enemies, it had the things that pollinate it and eat it, and it fits in to that ecosystem. When you bring an invasive plant in, you don't usually bring that entire group of organisms that work together. So, especially, you don't bring its enemies. So it gets over here, it has no enemies, and away it goes. So that's the thing. They come from everywhere. How do they get here? Well, the number one way that I'll list is a hitchhiker. Now, it's easier perhaps to think about an animal behaving like this. We have just this past, I'm going to say a month and a half now, we have identified a stink bug that has been on the, call it the watch list. It has now been found in Leon County, and we know exactly how it got here, on somebody's RV. They took a vacation, went to a place where these little stink bugs are a problem, came home, and found a bunch of them. And we've identified them, and did they find them and catch them and kill them all? We have no idea. But hitchhiking from place to place, plants can do that too. Fragments of plants, seeds of plants can be carried from place to place. And this is one reason why you'll have maybe a beautiful specimen of a plant that is invasive, and the owner says, well, that plant doesn't cause any problems. I've never seen any sprouts coming up. I've never seen any babies coming up. Well, maybe you haven't looked a mile away, you know. A surprising number of the plants that are invasive were brought over here by somebody and released on purpose because they thought it was going to be good for some reason or another. They thought it was a good idea. So they brought them over and turned them loose. Sometimes they're brought over on purpose, but released thoughtlessly. We'll meet some examples of both of these in a minute. I want you to remember that the environmental scientists will say this: you can't do just one thing. Anything that you do, and you know this in your garden, anything you do is going to have consequences, and then they're going to have consequences, and everything is connected. You can't bring an invasive plant over, turn it loose, and nothing happens. Invasive plants come in many shapes and sizes. We've got grasses, We've got forbs. I'll explain that word if you're not already familiar with it. Vines and shrubs. We've got invasive trees, and we've also got invasive aquatic plants. So we're going to see a few examples of each of these types. So hopefully that'll illustrate to you kind of how they work. Let's start with unwanted grasses. The first one is called cheatgrass, and it is, as far as I know, never been a problem here in Leon County. Giant cane is probably one you would recognize. If I had brought in some of that, you would probably have known giant cane. And maybe one or two of you out there might recognize KR bluestem. Let's see them in detail. Start with cheatgrass. Do you realize that we have a real problem out in the western United States with wildfires during the summer season? Big problem, big problem. Have you thought about why that is? It's this stuff as much as anything else. Cheatgrass is a cool season grass. If we find some of it here in Leon County, I'll tell you, right now, it would look beautiful. It would be green, it would be this tall, it would be making its seed heads, the cows would be eating it, you wouldn't think a thing about it. But out west, cheatgrass has replaced a lot of native grasses. And what is strange to me traveling out west, you'll be in what they call a forest. And I look around and it doesn't look like a forest to me. It looks like what I would call a savanna. It's a grassland with a tree here and there and here and there. They'll call it a forest. All of that land gets covered with cheatgrass. It has a very limited lifespan. It dies in the spring, and now you've got miles and miles of dead grass that burns like gasoline. And that's not the plant that is native to that area, and when it gets started, that's these wildfires that you hear out west because of this particular plant being the tinder. Giant cane around here, you should know that one.
Scarecrows.
Yeah, we used to use it in our scarecrows because it resembles corn in your first impression of a stalk of it. There's a rumor, and I don't know if it's true, that giant cane or arundo was brought here by Texas Department of Transportation. I don't know if TxDOT brought it over or not, but I do know that it is a roadside plant that used to be basically encouraged. It's
erosion control.
It's good for erosion control. It soaks up water. It is happiest growing in a bar ditch. But when that stuff gets loose on a riverbank, pretty soon you've got nothing else. Down in the lower Rio Grande and even down lower end of Brazos River, just as far as the eye can see, giant cane. It grows so thick that nothing grows among it. Once it gets established, it takes that area over. It dies down in cold winters. It had a hard time like this past winter. It's slow coming back. But don't worry, it will be back. And it'll get just as tall as it ever was. Most of those seeds are not fertile. But that doesn't matter because it mostly propagates from chunks coming off those rhizomes and floating downstream and starting another colony. KR bluestem, KR stands for King Ranch. That sounds like it ought to be a good thing. It isn't from the King Ranch. It is an invasive plant that was brought over in hopes that it would be a great forage plant for ranchers. But it turns out that it really isn't. It's not bulky. It's mostly stems. There's not a whole lot of leaf tissue to it. Cows don't like it better than anything else. But what it does do a lot of is make little seeds. And it spreads into pastures, taking the space of things that we would rather have out there. And there is nothing you can do effectively to control it. There's no chemical that kills KR bluestem that doesn't kill everything else too. So if you're a rancher, you don't like to see this stuff coming up the roadside. But it is very, very common on summer and fall roadsides. The bluestem grasses, big blue, little blue, those are the big native center of the United States, millions of buffalo ate them, wonderful native grasses. And this stuff is not.
You can tell the difference.
Yeah, oh yeah, yeah. This stuff, because it's kind of flimsy, it kind of lays down and
Like how tall does it get? How tall?
well, it gets about that tall and then it slips over.
So burning the pasture, yeah, eradicate.
It will not eradicate it. No, mowing won't, burning won't. Nothing. There's nothing to do.
You
Do
know,
buffalo like it?
Huh?
Do buffalo like it?
Maybe.
We need more buffalo.
Turn them loose on the highway, on the roadside. Now, a forb, I'm going to assume that there's several people in here that don't use the word forb a lot. A forb in rancher language is basically anything that's not grass that doesn't get tall. So it includes all of what we would call wildflowers, okay? Broadleaf plants, or if you want to get technical, dicots that are not big enough to call them shrubs. So low-growing, flowering plants that aren't grasses. A big group. Some of them are bound to be invasive. I picked a couple. I didn't really realize when I picked those two that there was like sexual overtones to invasive forbs, but that's purely coincidence. Clover, well, clover is good, but there are a lot of clovers that are not natives. And every time you have a non-native plant growing, there's a native plant that should have been there. So if you are trying to grow a field of clover, then you see that, you're happy with it. But if you weren't, not so much.
Is it not a ground cover?
Well,
Like to add nitrogen to the soil?
okay, clover's yes, clover's good. And for forage, clover is good if you're careful with your animals. But let's look at these two. We can't say much good about them at all. First of all, bastard cabbage. Now, I don't know why it's called that, but bastard cabbage is a close relative of all of those other, what we call brassicas. So that means this is going to resemble things like mustard and turnips and broccoli and cauliflower. And if I hold it like this, it won't look so wilted. Okay. This stuff right here, you will see it on roadsides. Right down there by Woody's. There's some on the roadside. And if all it ever did was be a roadside wildflower and one here and one there, it wouldn't be any big deal. But like many wildflowers, it actually sprouts in the fall and goes through a period of, during the wintertime, where it is growing very slowly. And at that time, the leaves are large and they basically lay almost flat on the ground. And it will cover an area about that big. And that means that that soil is shaded out and nothing else is going to grow right up there close to this plant. In the early spring, it shoots up, it makes flowers, it just gets bigger and bigger. They're not ugly, but if this is a pasture and this is all that's out there, you're in trouble. This is not something that even goats are going to get fat on this stuff. And if you get a lot of them growing side by side, there is no room for anything else. They will shade things out. So if you have a lawn or a pasture and you see some of this on the roadside a mile away from your house, and the next year it's half a mile away from your house, you need to do something about that. All of these flowers are making seeds. It needs to be cut down early before it can make seeds. And that is about the only thing you can do to improve this situation. Okay? So that is bastard cabbage. And watch for it on the roadsides right now. It is taller than almost everything else. And it's got these pretty little tiny yellow flowers with 4 petals. Don't confuse it with our native plants. This one is not good for you. Broom rape. I was so excited when I found some. I thought, ooh, I need to put that in the program. I'm going to get some pictures of it. I'm going to bring some specimens. They're never going to have seen it before. They're going to be amazed. Broom rape only gets about that tall. And all you see is the flower stalk. There are no associated leaves. That is because this plant is a parasite. It is living off its neighbors. It comes up, makes its little flowers, little purple flowers, makes seeds, and vanishes. But it is withdrawing nutrition from all the neighborhood flowers. And the reason I don't have one today, they mowed. You know where if you're going north on Highway 75, right at the edge of town, there's a cluster of storage buildings. They were in the soil around that storage building. And I went there about an hour ago to get you some specimens. They mowed 2 days ago. They're gone. Now, it turns out that mowing equipment is probably the main way that stuff is distributed. The seeds are really small, and that's where you're likely to see it and find it. You wouldn't want to see this in your lawn because it is sucking nutrition out of your desirable grasses. You wouldn't want to see it in your flower bed, even though it's got little purple flowers. You don't want this particular plant. Okay, let's think about some vines. One that we have fond memories of is Japanese honeysuckle. Again, it came from Asia. Been in the United States a long, long time. But it is a very persistent perennial vine that tolerates shade. And so you're out walking in the woods and there's a big clump of it. And you think, how'd that get there? Because there aren't any old homesteads or anything like that. Well, that's a characteristic invasive behavior, to escape from that cultivated place where it was planted and now it's out in the woods. I suggest that if you like honeysuckle, there's a wonderful native honeysuckle that is beautiful, the coral honeysuckle. And there are even a couple of cultivars of various colors. But coral honeysuckle is a beautiful scarlet color. The hummingbirds love it. So if you have this stuff, get rid of it and get the native stuff instead. Chinese wisteria. Well, you love it for about 2 weeks out of the year. And then the rest of the year, it's just the devil. You know, it sprouts up in the yard. It clambers over everything. It'll kill a tree, just the weight of it. And that just isn't worth that 2 weeks worth of beautiful and it smells good and all of that. Just not worth it. There is a native wisteria. Not quite as showy, but if you search for it, maybe you can find a native wisteria. And if you've got to grow this stuff, if you grow it away from everything else and give it a trellis, you can kind of make it into a specimen shrub thing. But then it's still going to be sprouting in the yard.
Well, that's the Chinese wisteria that's over there back behind an old parking lot of Dairy Queen?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
How many trees?
That picture right there, again, is going north on Highway 75 near Taylor's automotive place. Mm-hmm.
But what I'm getting at, I didn't see no trees. I don't see where it has as much of it as there is killing the trees over there by the Dairy Queen.
Well, maybe it just hasn't yet, but it just give it time. Yeah.
I just keep seeing multiple.
Mhm. There. Unwanted shrubs. Privet or ligustrum, there's several close relatives, and Vandina are a couple that we can mention. Privet is a big genus with several different examples, and one of the examples is waxleaf ligustrum, and just ordinary common privet is another. These, again, were brought in by the horticulture industry, and they have their place, I suppose, as a horticultural plant, but they make lots of berries that birds will eat, and they will come up everywhere. And out in the woods, they will come up. Again, this is a plant that will tolerate a good bit of shade. So you're walking through the woods and you're seeing bushes, and then you realize those bushes shouldn't be here. Those are privets. The flowers, again, kind of a beautiful thing for 2 weeks, but they don't smell good. Yeah. So I would not recommend this as a good choice from a horticultural point of view. Well, what about Nandina? The original variety of Nandina is a plant that will make a pretty large shrub. They will get 8 feet tall, easy. And dark green leaves, not much color to it. White flowers, red berries. The red berries are toxic, and birds will eat them, and they are toxic. A number of years ago, they started coming out with dwarf varieties and varieties that had a lot of color to the leaves, so they're pretty all the year, and they fall. Those are probably just fine, but it's the old-fashioned kind that will get out in the woods. And once again, you're walking through the woods and there's a big old Nandina. And there's another one, and there's another one. And I know of a place where the whole must be 2 acres of Nandina out there. Shouldn't be there.
So we're okay, then we planted the dwarf Nandina.
The little dwarf ones are probably okay.
Okay, we're not banned.
No, you're not a bad person if you plant. But I would suggest this, cut the berries off, just in case. Just don't let those berries persist.
Do the birds actually eat them even though?
They do.
Or really?
Yeah. A lot of things that are toxic, the animals won't mess with, but these are toxic and the birds will eat them. Yeah.
The gophers eat the roots off of them.
Well, that's,
Are the berries
That's a
poisonous to
blessing.
gophers?
hey, pick them off and poke them down that gopher. Yeah.
They like the roots, they don't like berries.
Yeah. Okay, let's consider some unwanted trees. Chinese tallow tree is very hard to find now because they've pretty much been banned. Used to, you could go to the nursery and buy them and everybody wanted them. Chinese tallow, the glorious part of the Chinese tallow was the color in the fall. They're beautiful in the fall if they're in a place that gets a lot of sunshine.
Fast growing.
And
Makes
they're
good
fast
shade
growing.
tree.
Here's the problem. They say, buy land, they're not making any more of it. Yeah, we are. We're taking big pieces of land and making subdivisions out of them. All right? Now, the easy way to make your subdivision is to bulldoze everything. Build your houses, build your curbs and your gutters and your sewer, and then come in and put 1 tree in each front yard and 2 trees in each backyard, and you're done. Well, landscapers don't think about biodiversity. And they're not, the whole system is not set up to provide landscapers with much of a choice anyway. Here's a short list of trees that are grown commercially, and what is a landscaper looking for? Fast, cheap. Well, the problem with fast-growing trees is most of them break. They're fragile, they're brittle, they come apart. They don't live a long time. Fast-growing, short life. A lot of these plants also, when you look at them, a tree that's got a branch that comes off at a wide angle like that, that's good, that's strong. But if that angle is real small, the bark gets caught as the tree grows, moisture collects, fungus starts, and that limb is going to break. And some of these trees, their growth habit, they just put up a whole lot of limbs that are real tight together. Because at first, that makes a nice shape. But in the long run, it's weak. So,
I've seen an album where they take those tallow trees and they just cut them off, everything. And then they grow back and they make the prettiest round tree.
yeah, for a few years.
Yeah.
Tallow is an unusual plant in that it is about the only tree in its whole family. And some people call them popcorn trees. The seeds that they make are very light and they float. And that is why tallow trees are so invasive. Because anywhere water can carry those seeds, that's where you're going to find tallow. I've got a back pasture that floods from a creek, and I am fighting them all the time. Texas Parks and Wildlife fights them around most of our state parks have lakes and ponds. They're very bad, and we spend a lot of tax dollars on people trying to kill tallow trees. I'll say one good thing about them, bees, the European honeybees love tallow,
And it makes the best honey.
and it makes good honey. But remember, that was the European honeybee, not native either. Tallow trees will form a monoculture because they are, to some extent, an allelopathic plant, and that means that plant is toxic to other plants. It's like they clear out a space for their own kind. The Bradford pear is another favorite of landscapers. Question?
I was going to say something about the root system.
Oh.
Of the tallow tree.
Yeah.
It's enormous. When I was a little girl, my daddy planted 3 of them by a new house on the side. And he planted it maybe 12 feet away, and they grew so much to get out of the house. So that can be another problem.
Another problem, yeah. The most effective way of attacking a tallow tree is certainly not by mowing it down, because they will sprout right back. The specimen that I've got right here, this is off of a plant that was mowed last year. And you can see it came up from the sprouts, and now this is the new growth on last year's sprouts. And in no way was this plant harmed by my taking the switch off of it. Okay? That plant is doing just fine. The Bradford pear, and I don't have a specimen of them, calorie pear is the wild plant, and Bradford is a cultivated variety of it. It is still available. Landscapers are still using a lot of calorie pears or Bradford pears, and it is used as a rootstock for grafting fancy kinds of pears onto. So if you buy a pear tree and something happens and the top gets broken out and it sprouts back from the roots, this is what you're going to have, is a calorie pear. The pears that it makes are about as big as your thumbnail. They have a pear odor, but they're bitter, bitter, bitter. They're worthless as far as a fruit. But there's a bunch of them. About half of the white things that you see blooming in the forests in the spring are escaped calorie pears. They're not native plums and dogwoods like they ought to be. You tromp out there, you're going to find an old pear tree. It's this stuff. I do not recommend you buy them. I don't recommend that you park underneath them because they're very fragile and those limbs will break. Chinaberry, that's this thing. This is a sprout. This is a 2-year sprout. And again, it was not harmed by my taking this one. Things like chinaberry and tallow, probably the best way to control them is a combination of cutting the stalk off and immediately putting a herbicide on that cut wound without waiting. It's kind of a 2-person job. One to cut and one to paint the chemical on there. And the chemicals, Richard can give you a list of what's good, and most of them you dilute with diesel and then just paint it on. It's a lot better chance of killing them than just whacking them down, because that will not kill them. This is a chinaberry, and again, this is a plant that's been in the United States for a long, long time. And it's a graceful tree, and the flowers are pretty, and the fruit are toxic. little boys love to throw them at little girls, don't they? Yeah. And it sprouts by seeds, and it comes up from the root system. So again, a China berry in your neighborhood, pretty soon you've got a lot of China berries in your neighborhood. This is one that I could not get a specimen of because I do not know who's got one.
And they stink.
Oh, this is a really, really bad idea. Do not fall for planting one of these in your yard. The tree of heaven, or Ailanthus, it is that ideal fast growing landscaper type tree, but its roots go out and will crack. They will crack pavement. They will do a lot of damage with their roots. They are allelopathic. They will clear out everything around themselves, and they're just bad news all the way around. Don't recommend them for anywhere.
That's the tree that moth likes, it's just kind of.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
We ought to change its name. Tree of heaven and tree of hell.
It would be more appropriate.
It's illegal to sell.
Yep. If you have any interest in water features in your garden, you have to be pretty careful about what kind of plants you put into them. We've got plants in nature in North America now that came in as ornamentals to water features or ornamentals brought in by the aquarium trade and basically turned loose. And this is where I said one of the ways that plants get around is turned loose accidentally. A lot of aquatic things get turned loose when people get tired of their aquarium, so they just take it and dump it in the creek, and that's why we have things like Plecostomus and goldfish and a lot of things like that that shouldn't be here, and aquatic plants as well. I'm going to mention 3 of them here. Water hyacinths are beautiful. If you've ever seen a bayou full of them in bloom, they're lovely. They're very picturesque. And a good thing about them is that they have the ability to reduce water pollution. But that does not excuse all the rest of their bad behavior. Water hyacinths are banned. I mean, you are breaking the law to have water hyacinths. Plants that can grow the way water hyacinths do, completely cover, they put shade into the water. That kills any plant material in the lower parts. That dead plant material has to decay. The decay uses up all the oxygen, and then the fish die. It's a cycle eutrophication that is a real problem in some areas, and all you have to have is a completely covered aquatic area, and you're likely to have a fish kill. Water lettuce is a very similar plant except no pretty flowers. It clogs water surfaces, clogs drains, and this came in as an aquarium plant. Hydrilla. A hydrilla almost completely ruined Lake Conroe and a whole lot of other areas. Hydrilla is a submerged rooted plant, so it will grow in shallow water. It never grew out in the deep part of Lake Conroe or any other lake, but it would grow up near the shore, and then as boats would try to go through it, the propeller would chop it up, and every little fragment is going to be the start of a new plant. A lot of things were proposed to kill it. There are chemicals that you can put out that will kill it, but it takes so much that it wasn't practical to try to kill it that way, and they weren't perfectly effective anyway. What we finally did in Lake Conroe was to bring in the animal that eats them from the same habitat where they came from. But sometimes that biological control goes bad wrong. And sometimes you just end up with two problems instead of one problem. With the grass carp, they were pretty well able to develop ones that they ate the hydrilla, they didn't eat much else, and they got great big and then they died. They didn't reproduce. And you can get grass carp now if you are willing to jump through a whole lot of Texas Parks and Wildlife hoops. You can get it if you have a problem with that stuff. And that finally got, grass carp finally got the hydrilla in Lake Conroe down to a tolerable level, but it'll never all be gone. So, we have met the enemy, and he is us. Most of the plants that we have that we call invasive, we can track down to who is at fault for them being here. But most of the time, that group, that organization, or that industry didn't mean to do a bad thing. It just turned out that way. So, be careful about putting your own yard in as a problem area. Don't plant invasives in the first place would be the thing. If there's a wonderful plant but it's an invasive, look for something similar that's native. Remove invasives that can be a source of seeds or vegetative parts from your property, and use best management practices. And this is all about learning what's going to work, what is the minimum amount of money and effort that you can spend to get the job done of getting rid of invasives, and then educate others. How do you find out more? Well, there are a couple of very good places to find information. If you say, oh, I don't know whether this plant is invasive or not, here's a couple of places that you can go and find information about them. InvasiveSpeciesInfo.gov and TexasInvasives.org are two very reliable sources of information about invasives. Natives are best, you know. For if you want to be cheap, if you want to be lazy, natives are the best. The problem with trying to plant natives is going to the nursery and finding what you want for sale. If more of us went to nurseries and asked, where are your native plants? I'm looking for native plants. Where is your native plant department? If they heard that question frequently, you know what they would do? They would get themselves a native plant department. If you lived in Austin and you went to a nursery and you asked that question, you know what? They'd point right to it. Native plants are big in that area. So let's just all load up and go to Austin and get us some native plants.
They're native.
And they're native to there, but not to here, right? Yeah, that's right. Okay, what questions do you have? We have 5 minutes.
I think we could talk bobos and stuff.
We can pick your
Talk
brain.
bobos into getting the native stuff.
I ask that question every time I go, and if everybody else would too, I bet you would, because, you know, they're in business to serve the customer. Yeah.
Is there a
website or something, we can find out what would be native to this area?
One of the best websites is going to be the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center, which I believe is wildflower.org. Of course, it all depends on if you know the name of the plant you're looking at in the first place. If you know the name of the plant, there's all kinds of places you can look up information about. So, you know, if you're a master gardener, bring the specimens to a meeting and we're going to know probably what it is or where we can find out. Nobody knows all the plants, okay? There's just too many. But we can usually come real close.
That's like kudzu. Kudzu from the East Coast.
Thank goodness we never had to really deal with that here.
Well, they put that in for erosion control.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
now they've discovered that they can make flour out of it and cook with it.
Yeah, it's edible.
They found a use for it.
Yep. And cows and goats will eat it.
I didn't hear what you're talking about.
Kudzu.
Oh, kudzu.
Kudzu.
Kudzu, oh man, I went to North Carolina several weeks.
Oh, no, kudzu. Kudzu is that.
Smother out that other kind of cane.
Find something they'll eat.
That is kudzu. That's kudzu.
There you go.
Yes, that's everywhere.
You don't think that switch cane, you smother out that other kind of cane?
Uh-uh.
Oh, you should see
No.
those crickets.
Kudzu, that is the vine that ate the sap. Yeah.
But I'm talking about the switch cane. You don't think it would smother out
Native
that other
switch
one?
cane will not smother it. Native switch cane is a wonderful plant that I've got plenty of, but it is pretty tender. It will, you can grace it out, and
I'm new to the area, but what are all these yellow flowers in our cow pastures and are they invasive?
There are about 5 different things that it might be, but I will say if it is just about through blooming now, and it's just been everywhere, locals call that stuff yellow tops. A better name would be groundsel, 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 or squaw weed. The nice thing about that particular plant is that it grows, it blooms, it dies, it vanishes. And so, depending on where you are, like I have a hay field, I don't even worry about it. It's gone by the time. Yeah, I'm not concerned about it. It is somewhere between unpalatable and mildly toxic. So grazing animals just leave it alone. And so that's why it does so well, because nothing's eating it down.
Are you talking about the tall one?
Well,
It's really tall?
Yellow tops get height according to how happy they are. They'll bloom when they're this tall if the soil is poor, but they'll get this tall if it's rich. They're very adaptive. But that is our early spring. It's everywhere. Plant.
And then goatweed in the fall.
Huh?
Goatweed in the fall.
And then there's goatweed in the fall.